The Year of the Black Pony by Walt Morey, Chapter 5. Sunday morning, we held a conference on whether to go to church or not. To me, it didn't matter. Ellie wanted to go. That was exciting to her, seeing the other people, listening to the singing, and above all, getting dressed up. She kept yelling, "I want to go," until Ma told her to be quiet. Mr. Chase said, "I'm against it. If we walk in there together, everybody's going to know." "They're going to know in a few days anyway," Ma said. "What better way for the whole valley to find out than for us to go in there this morning like a family?" "I don't like it," Mr. Chase said. "People talking, whispering behind their hands, staring at us." "I don't think they will," Ma said. "Not if we go to church together. If we walk in there acting perfectly natural, they'll wonder a little, of course. We've got to expect that." "I haven't been attending as regular as I should," Mr. Chase hedged. "When you've got work to do, you let it slip." "Most ranchers do, especially in the spring. Reverend Jackson and everybody in the valley understands that." Ellie opened her mouth again, but Ma stopped her with a look. "All right," Mr. Chase finally said. "If you think you can pull it off." "We'll pull it off," Ma said. We went in the buggy, just as we had yesterday. Mr. Chase drove. This time he sat straight and held the lines up snug. Ma had pressed his suit and shirt. He looked as neat as any man. Nellie sensed a difference and trotted along at a smart clip. We were late and services were about to begin. The small church was almost full. Mr. Chase started to slip into an almost empty pew in the back, but Ma marched right up down the aisle, about 2/3 of the way to the front, where there was a vacant pew. We all followed. There had been a faint buzz of talk, as there always was before services begin. I noticed as we went forward that it sort of fell off. By the time we sat down, you could have heard a pin drop. Almost. After a minute, the low talk began again and went on about as usual until the Reverend stepped up to the pulpit. Mr. Chase's ears were red and he looked down at his hands. Ma sat through the service erect and prim, looking straight at Reverend Jackson, paying close attention to every word. Not once did she glance right or left. She held Ellie's hand, and when Ellie wanted to gawk around, Ma gave it a warning squeeze. I stole a couple of looks, and I could see we got a few quick glances, especially from the women, but there was no whispering behind hands. It seemed to me like the usual Sunday service. At the end, we walked out with the rest of the congregation, and Reverend Jackson made a point of speaking to Ma and Mr. Chase. Some of the men spoke to Mr. Chase, and women nodded and smiled at Ma. We got in the buggy and drove off. Mr. Chase wiped his face with a handkerchief and said, "Longest sermon I ever sat through." "It was the usual length," said Ma. "An hour." "Seemed like at least 2 to me, but you brought it off," he said admiringly. "I didn't think it could be done, but you brought that whole bunch to heel." "There wasn't a woman or man there that didn't know that what we did was the only practical thing," Ma said. "Reverend Jackson helped, too." "Sure he helped," Mr. Chase agreed, "but it was you who had this figured right down to a gnat's eye." After lunch, Mr. Chase hitched Jess and Jip to the wagon to go to our old place for a load of furniture and anything else Ma thought we might need. She and Ellie went in the wagon. I rode Nellie bareback so I could drive our cattle back to Mr. Chase's. While they loaded up the wagon, I rounded up the cattle. As I drove them to the house, Mr. Chase came out. "They look good," he said, "nice and fat. Why don't you go on? Take plenty of time. Don't let 'em run. We'll be along as soon as we get loaded." I was about halfway when they passed me. Ellie waved and yelled. This was all fun for her. We now had about a mile farther to go to school, so we rode Nellie, me in front, Ellie behind, her arms wrapped around my waist to hold on. We had our books strapped together, and we carried lunches in small blue lard pails. Ma saw us off. She gave me a meaningful look and said, "You take care of Ellie." I kind of figured at school something might happen, like a kid saying something nasty, but nobody did. Bill Lyons sort of grinned and said, "I seen you in church yesterday." I doubled up my fist and walked right up to him. If anybody started talk or poking fun at us, it'd be him. I was about as big as he was. I looked him right in the eye and said, "Sure, I saw you too. What about it?" He shrugged. "Nothing. I seen you, that's all." He knew I was ready for him. Ma was a great organizer, and Mr. Chase was a fast worker with saw and hammer. Within a week, they had practically transformed the inside of that cabin so you'd hardly know it. In a couple of days, Mr. Chase had built a partition across one end of the room, making a bedroom for Ma and Ellie. They moved our big bed in there. My cot went against the other side of the partition. Mr. Chase's single bunk went into an opposite corner of the room where they hung a blanket to give him privacy. Next, he punched a hole through the wall for a door and built a lean-to for his bedroom. Ma hung the curtains from our old place on the windows and put the braided rug on the floor near the table. She made flour sack curtains and hung them across the open food shelves to hide pots and pans and food boxes. Mr. Chase looked at it and confessed, "Sure looks better than it did. Not a bachelor's quarters anymore. Curtains at the windows, rug on the floor, fire in the stove, the smell of cooking, and you've got a home," Ma said proudly. "Got to admit, if I get much more of this kind of cooking, I'll gain 20 pounds. You need 20 pounds on that big frame. Then I'll be fat, and a fat rancher is a lazy rancher." When school was out 3 weeks later, we were all settled in, and things were running smooth. Ellie had a last small bout with sore throat. Then Ma figured she was through with that till winter set in again. But changes did take place, some that I'd never have suspected. For one, Ellie got along fine with Mr. Chase right off. In no time, she was tagging around after him, chattering away. A couple of times Ma said, "Ellie," pretty sharp. She tried to divert Ellie's attention to something like setting the table or gathering the eggs, one of her chores. One night, while Mr. Chase was reading the little weekly paper, she crawled up in his lap, like she used to with Pa. Ma said sharply, "Ellie, don't bother Mr. Chase." "She's not bothering me," he said quietly. "She's bothering you. There's no need to include the kids in this formal setup you've devised." Ma's lips got tight, and her head came up as it always did, but she didn't say anything, and Ellie stayed. I heard Ma say to him once later, "You do seem to have a way with children." "I should," he answered. "I was the oldest of 4 boys and 2 girls. Ma had worked out a kind of formal setup all right. She'd practically split the house down the middle right at the stove. She moved the table over that imaginary line so that his end was on his side. The easy chair with the cowhide bottom was there too. And over there were his lean-to bedroom, his clothes, the deer horn rack that held his rifle and shotgun. Maybe he just naturally gravitated to that side of the room because his things were there. Anyway, he spent very little time on our side of the house. Ma called him Mr. Chase except when they were around other people, like at church, or when Reverend Jackson and several of the ladies came to call. Then she said Frank. In some ways, he adjusted better than Ma. He had a sly kind of humor that delighted in sticking pins in her. Ellie started calling him Daddy Frank. And when Ma said sharply, "Ellie, I've told you," Mr. Chase interrupted with, "What's wrong? Are you afraid of losing her?" "Certainly not," Ma said. "You must be. Seems a mother should be mighty pleased if her child came to like her stepfather." "You should understand," Ma said stiffly. "I don't. Why don't you spell it out for me good and plain?" Ma couldn't or wouldn't, and Ellie kept calling him Daddy Frank. He called Ma Mabel all the time, and she finally reminded him coolly that it wasn't necessary at home. "Seems to me that's where it's most necessary," he said, "but then I'm not a very good hypocrite." "Meaning I am?" "Not at all," he smiled. "We were talking about me." I'm sure he enjoyed ruffling her feathers, but Ma didn't give an inch. For myself, I got along with him, but I was careful. I called him Mr. Chase. He called me Boy. Whenever I worked with him, I did whatever he asked as well as possible. But he made no friendly advances, and I certainly didn't. I couldn't accept him the way Ellie did. That small fear of him which sprang up in me the first morning never left. I couldn't help wondering what he'd do to me if he really lost his temper. What if he started beating me the way Pa used to? With school out, I began riding Nellie over to our old place every other day. I watered and hoed the vegetables and carried back a sack of vegetables each trip. In between times, I worked with Mr. Chase. We built a small shed for the chickens. Then I helped grease the rake and mower, get the hay rack on, and turned the grindstone for hours while he sharpened the sickle bar in preparation for mowing. Mr. Chase cut his 15 acres one day. Then the next day he went out to our old place and cut the 10. He let both fields lie until the hay was dry. Then he hitched Jess and Jip to the big rake and let me do the raking. I had no trouble except that my windrows were crooked. But Mr. Chase said it didn't matter. He followed behind with a pitchfork and built the windrows into shocks. He let me handle the team on the hay wagon when we hauled it in. He pitched the shocks into the wagon where I spread them and built the load. I wasn't very good at it, but he didn't seem to mind. It took 2 days to haul in his 15 acres. The next day he spent in the barn moving the hay around to make room for more. I took the team and rake to our old place to windrow the 10 acres he'd cut. It was 3 days since I'd been there, and the garden was beginning to suffer. I spent about 2 hours pumping and carrying water to it. The sun was standing right overhead when I finally headed to the alfalfa field. I had to rake especially slow because Pa hadn't done a good job leveling the land before seeding it. The teeth bounced at even a slow walk, and I missed some. It was mighty monotonous. The sun was about halfway down the western sky when, for the first time in weeks, I began thinking about Fletcher's black pony. I kept thinking about him as I made round after round. There were about a dozen rounds left when I knew I had to see him again. I glanced at the lowering sun. It was about time for the hired hand to ride out and drive them in. They could be thundering along the ridge any time now. I could slip up there, watch them pass, and get back to finish the raking in plenty of time. I lifted the rake and drove as far up the slope as I dared. I tied the team to a stump at the edge of a brush patch and began hiking to the top. It didn't take more than 20 minutes to reach the rock pile where I always watched. I stretched out on my stomach to wait. About half a mile down, I could see the patch of brush where the team was tied, but I couldn't see them. Beyond was the green square of the alfalfa field with my pattern of windrows. Time passed. The sun sank lower. The band of horses didn't come. I stood up on the rock to look, but it didn't help. I couldn't wait much longer. It would take at least another hour to finish the raking. Maybe Fletcher wasn't letting them run loose anymore, or maybe they'd already gone by. The sun was dropping toward the top of the single big pine tree far in the distance. When it hit the top, I told myself I'd have to leave. The sun hit the top of the tree. I realized then that climbing up here to see a half-wild pony was a silly kid trick. What difference did it make if I ever saw him again or not? He was Fletcher's horse. It was time I quit dreaming an impossible dream. I stood up to leave, and that moment I heard the familiar distant thunder of pounding hoofs. I froze. My heart climbed into my throat, as it always did at the thought of seeing him again. Here they came, bursting out onto the ridge in a boil of dust and tossing manes and heads. The black pony was in the lead. He ran as he always did, head high, mane and tail snapping. His nostrils were spread wide until I could see a rim of red running on the wings of the wind like he loved being free. They pounded past right under me. One of Fletcher's riders brought up the rear. I watched until they'd rounded the shoulder of rock and were gone. It took a couple of minutes for the excitement in me to die down. Then I went racing down the steep slope to the brush patch where I had tied the team. They were gone. I just stood there and looked at the stump with the broken rein still wrapped around it. I couldn't believe it. I glanced around expecting to see them standing near eating alfalfa. They were nowhere in sight. Something had spooked them. They'd broken the rein and taken off. I'd seen a runaway once, and terrified horses are a scary sight. Anything could happen, and in this big open country, they could be anywhere, maybe miles away by now. I began searching the ground for tracks or something to indicate the direction they'd gone. I saw where windrows had been scattered. Walking horses wouldn't do that. They'd have stopped to eat. Farther on, windrows were broken apart. That seemed to head in the direction of the barn and the house. I tore out as fast as I could. When I rounded the corner of the barn, there they stood in the barnyard, quietly waiting for someone to let them in. The rake was still hitched to them, but the first thing I noticed was that one iron wheel was badly bent. I walked around the team, patted them, and talked quietly as I inspected the harness. They appeared to have been here some time. They weren't sweaty, and they were no longer nervous, as runaways would have been. Several harness straps were broken, letting the gear to one side sag. One rein was still intact. Tugs, collars, hames were all right. Next, I inspected the rake carefully, and I began to feel sick. One side of the iron wheel was dented in at least 6 inches. 5 spokes were bent. 3 rake teeth were almost straight. A half dozen others were bent at varying angles. This rake could not be used. I doubted it could be repaired. Mr. Chase would have to buy a new rake, and maybe he didn't have the money. Without a rake, 2 more cuttings of alfalfa would go to waste in the field. There'd be no feed to carry the cattle through the winter. The loss of this rake could break Mr. Chase. I picked up a rock and began trying to hammer the dent out of the wheel. It did no good, but I had to do something. Tears started, and I couldn't stop them. I wiped them away and kept hammering. Then Frank Chase's voice said behind me, "What happened? You have a runaway?" He was riding Nellie bareback. He slid off and dropped the reins. When you didn't come home, I figured something must have happened. He walked around the team, inspecting the harness, talking halfway to himself. "I can fix this. I've got extra straps and rivets. No special problems here." He came back to the rake. I said, it's ruined, and it's all my fault." I began hammering the wheel again. The tears kept coming. He took the rock away from me and said, "Suppose we look it all over before we make any rash decisions." He began a careful inspection of the rake. "I can straighten most of these teeth myself. 3 of them will have to go to the blacksmith shop along with the wheel." "The rake's not ruined? It can be fixed?" I asked. "Of course it can be fixed. This is bad, but I've seen worse. It'll hold us up a couple of days, but luckily there's no rain in sight, so we won't lose any of this hay by it getting wet." "What happened anyway? Something spooked them? Say something, boy." I'd have known exactly what to expect from Pa. He'd have started yelling like mad, and then I'd have got it. Good. No questions, no explanations asked for. Mr. Chase had me completely confused. He was calm, quiet. For just an instant, I thought of manufacturing some kind of lie, but I knew immediately it wouldn't work. This man had more knowledge of horses, ranching, and machinery than I did. "I don't know what happened," I said. "What do you mean you don't know?" I wasn't with them when they ran away." "You weren't on the rake? Well, maybe you were lucky. You could have been hurt bad." "I wasn't anywhere near," I said miserably. I tied the team to a stump and climbed to the top of Christmas Ridge. He put his big fists on his hips and stared at me. "That's just a barren ridge. What were you doing up there?" I wiped my nose with my sleeve. Here it came, I thought. A crazy explanation that was no excuse at all. I went up there to see a horse. "A horse." He just looked at me for maybe half a minute. Then he leaned against the side of the rake, folded his arms, and said, "Tell me about it." I told him about Fletcher's young stock and how I'd been watching them all spring. He listened without saying a word. "Going up there was a crazy thing to do," I finished. "Didn't seem like it at the time, did it?" I shook my head, only after I came down and found the team gone. "I've seen that band of young stuff," he said. "Which one catches your eye?" I wondered if he was playing with me like a cat, a mouse, before he began beating me half to death as I deserved. "A black pony," I said. He nodded. "I know the one, full of life and fire. You've got a good eye for horse flesh, but that animal's no good for anything." "I don't understand," I said. "He could have made a fine horse, but he's been ruined. He's an outlaw. Starts to buck the minute a rider hits the saddle. Fletcher keeps him to have fun with around the 4th of July or other gatherings of people. He's been ridden, I hear, but he always puts up a terrific fight. Animal like that's no good on a ranch." "What made him an outlaw?" I was saying anything to try to hold his interest, to put off the beating I was sure I would get. I kept watching for those brown eyes to turn almost black and the heavy brows to come down in the ugly scowl that meant he was angry. "He's been abused by men," Frank Chase said. "Now there's a pony you can walk up to if you're careful. Put a halter on and even lead. But the minute your leg goes over his back, he starts to fight. He figures he has to. Dreaming about such a horse made this runaway seem even worse. No matter what Mr. Chase did to me, he'd probably never trust me again with the team. "Did you finish the raking?" he asked. I had about another hour. "We'll come over in the morning, remove the wheel and the damaged teeth, and take 'em into the blacksmith. When they're fixed, you can come back tomorrow and finish." "When they're fixed, you can come back and finish, probably day after tomorrow." "You'd trust me with the team after this?" "Why not? You think you're the only person that ever pulled a dumb trick. I bet my bottom dollar it won't happen again. Besides, a boy should daydream a little. I did, and so did every kid I know." He smiled. "I had 2 big dreams. The horse I wanted was white as snow and belonged to the richest man in town. It was a sight to see him on that horse. I didn't have a chance in the world of ever owning that animal, and I knew it, but that didn't stop me dreaming about it. I wanted him so bad it hurt." "What was your other dream?" I asked. 1,000 head of fat beef cattle roaming my own land. That, your ma would say, was the practical one. I'm still working on it. To date, counting your ma's stock, I'm about 961 head short." I knew then there'd be no licking. I was relieved, and in a crazy kind of way, a little disappointed, because now I was more confused than ever about Frank Chase. "Guess we better be getting home so I can fix this harness yet tonight. You want to ride Nellie? You're lighter. I'll ride Jess." We rode side by side, him in one road rut and me in the other, Gyp following. I asked, what could have spooked them? "No telling. A pheasant jumping out of the grass at their feet, a rabbit. I once had a runaway when a piece of paper blew up in front of the team. Maybe it was a good thing you weren't on the rake. You might not have been able to hold them." We were almost home when he observed, "Your ma's going to wonder what happened." "I know," I said. "It's over and done. There's no sense bothering her with the details. She know about you going up to watch that black pony of Fletcher's run?" "No." "Good. Then let me handle the explanations." We rode along in silence. Then he said, half to himself, "Quite a woman, your ma." "Yes, sirree, Bob, quite a woman."